everyone's enjoying the meal. We are going to proceed with the program, if you don't mind. Obviously, you can continue eating, as you will. All we ask is that you have the conversation with these guys. It's my pleasure to introduce John Mueller from Ohio State, who's going to be talking about the demise of war. I think I was asked to do this because I'm the person who put forward his name as the possible keynote speaker for the event. I should confess that Professor Mueller and I are both in the international relations field, which, if you don't know much about international relations, we study how nation states behave towards one another, and most people in the field treat nation states almost as if they're people. But they're not particularly nice people ordinarily in international relations. International relations is dominated by pessimists. Most people in the field borrow ideas about selfishness from economists, right? So these are selfish individuals in international politics. And then they borrow the Hobbesian logic of how those people interact in a state of nature. Because after all, in international politics, there is no central authority. There's no world government. These states all interact with one another. And if you don't recall your Hobbes, in such an environment, life is nasty, brutish, and short, right? So that's the field we come from. And basically, the predominant idea in the field for many years has been that the threat of war and other kinds of violence is ever present, right? So it's a field dominated by pessimists who study nation states primarily so they can see them in conflict and potentially at war with one another. So in 1989, Professor Mueller published a book called Retreat from Doomsday: The Obsolescence of Major Power War. Essentially, I think he's going to be talking about the continuation of those ideas today, so I'm not going to spoil it too much. But I can tell you that those ideas were very influential on me. That year, 1989, is also the year I finished my dissertation. And in 1990, I interviewed here at the University of Louisville. I don't know if Chuck remembers, he's older than me. But in my talk for getting this job, not my research presentation, but my lecture to students, I primarily emphasized the obsolescence of major power wars. So Professor Mueller's work has been very influential in my career for many years. Since he published that book, by the way, these ideas have started to get a foothold. So, as Russ mentioned this morning, there's some other scholars in the field who are working on similar kinds of arguments and looking at real hard data about the decline of war. The Human Security Report, all kinds of different people. So we're going to be hearing about some of those. I'm going to also introduce next, before I introduce Dr. Mueller, I'm introducing Anthony Minotti, who's a graduating senior from political science, who's going to talk a little bit about Professor Mueller's biography and how the ideas have influenced him. As he's had the misfortune of having a couple of my classes where, fortunately, he's read some pieces by Professor Mueller. Anthony?
Like Professor Payne said, I'm a graduating senior in the political science department. Yeah, it's an honor to be here to introduce Dr. Mueller. He's a fellow in the Gershon Center at The Ohio State University. He's written scores of articles, tons of provocative books about international politics, including Atomic Obsession, later when it's Overblown, about how we perceive threats abroad. And in the past 10 years or so, he's focused a lot on nuclear terrorism. And to me, I've always been, as soon as I've heard some of his ideas in a class, I've just been struck by how we actually assess risk abroad. And it's had a huge impact on what are our real risks. And looking into the future of international conflict and global politics, it's really important to have someone like Dr. Mueller who has a very rational approach to what our real risks are and what our real threats are abroad. So, without anything else, it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Mueller.
Okay, thanks very much. It's really great to be here. Let me start, since this is an International Peace Day, I thought I might start with the antidote, which is a quote from Immanuel Kant in 1790, talking about how a prolonged peace promotes commercial self-interest and debasing self-interest, cowardice, and effeminacy, and tends to degrade the character of the nation. What I'd like to do is sort of look at that kind of idea and bring it up to date in many respects. Let me give you a quick biography. This was the book that was mentioned, Retreat from Doomsday, the Obsolescence of Major War, or Major War being war among developed states. I wrote it in 1989, which is not the most fashionable time to come up with this idea. It mainly focused on the fact that what I called at the time history's greatest non-event, which was World War III. We're still waiting for World War III. It doesn't seem to be getting any closer. Anyway, many people thought I was basically crazy. Later on, I developed, since that book dealt only with great power wars or wars among developed states, I then extended in 2004 a book called The Remnants of War, in which I expanded looking at all international wars, not only wars among developed countries, and also against, also then bringing in civil wars, which were, which are a large number. This actually isn't the final cover. I'll talk more about the guy with the boobs later on. But anyway, I sent this to my sister, my daughter who lives in Cincinnati, and she said, that's the design, you gotta be kidding. Reading from the top, it says, Remnants of War, John Mueller, picture of John Mueller. So I thought that was, well, a plausible interpretation, I guess, that they could avoid the problem by justifying my name, putting my name above the title. But my preferred solution is basically just to have a little tasteful disclaimer under there, not the message below. But they didn't take that one out. More recently, if you want to read sort of the updated version of my work, I did an article in the summer of 2009, 3 years ago, Wars Almost Ceased to Exist, an assessment, which sort of brings all that up to that time. And then more recently, just last year, a book called War and Ideas, which also develops that. Okay, as this title suggests, maybe I should have called it War is an Idea. The basic idea that in a lot of my research is that war is merely an idea. For example, another idea is wearing your hat backwards, your baseball cap backwards. When I grew up, no one put their caps on backwards unless they were playing catcher in baseball, or unless they were pretending to be, or actually were, an idiot. But since that time, of course, it's become fashionable. I have no idea why that happened. I watched with amazement as it took place. But it basically is there. Clearly, you don't need the front of the cap because you can always use your hand to shake it. Anyway, the point is, it's just an idea. I mean, where did it come from? I don't know. But what I've been interested in particularly, not only in terms of war, but also democracy and capitalism, is idea entrepreneurs trying to sell ideas. Most of the time they fail, but sometimes they're successful. And that's what I want to deal with now. If the baseball cap analogy is a little bit too trivial for you, let me talk about two other things. Dueling used to be extremely common in the world, particularly in Europe. It was the, as some people put it at the time in dueling manuals, it was a necessary consequence of offense. And people have been trying to get rid of it for a very long time. The church was against it, the secular law was against it, and the military was totally opposed to it because the result of it was that all their best officers were busy killing each other off, which is not the best way to build an effective military. During the course of the 19th century, however, finally, it became so ridiculous that it ceased. What happened was previously you dueled, everybody said, wow, that's really cool, tell me about it. Now if you duel, people said, that's the most stupid thing I ever heard of. In fact, the guy who did the last duel in the United States was so humiliated that he went to Paris for 6 years. Okay, everybody knows what dueling is, and what it has now become is basically what I would call sub-rationally unthinkable. If we still have young men, they still get into arguments over the same things, their honor, their dignity, being dissed, and so forth. But the people in that social class who used to feel that they had to challenge the other guy to a duel simply don't do it anymore. It's not simply that they think about it, I can challenge this guy to a duel, but I might get killed, so that's not a good thing, so maybe I won't challenge him. That would be rational. Instead, it never occurs to them In other words, it doesn't even come up as something that you would think about doing. So it's basically sub-rationally unthinkable, or really unthinkable if you don't even think about it. Even if a word did make sense. And obviously you could have duels, quite legal duels, with boxing gloves, for example. And people don't even think about that. Just like at one time they never thought about wearing their baseball hats backward. Even more substantial is the demise of slavery. Slavery is one of the great master institutions of the human race. It goes back forever. When countries won wars, they enslaved the people they conquered and so forth, which is the main source of slaves throughout the millennia of history. It was built in religion. God tells the Israelites to take slaves in the Bible, etc. And it was just a natural order of things. That people thought, well, some people are meant to be masters and some people are meant to be slaves. And particularly losers in wars, obviously, are meant to be slaves. It was just a natural thing. But about 200 years ago, some people started jumping up and down in England and saying, we should get rid of slavery. It's stupid, it's bad, it's immoral, it's unjust, whatever. And the response to that was overwhelmingly negative, giving the arguments they've already given you. It's a natural order of things, et cetera, et cetera. But within 100 years, slavery, certainly formal slavery, in what was then known as Christendom, had died. The last big slave system was in Brazil, which died out, I think, in 1879. And nothing has replaced it. Nothing has replaced dueling. We now have, if you don't have slaves, then you have free labor. We already had free labor before. There's just more of it. And so the idea basically of that also becomes, the idea of reinstituting slavery, which is not physically impossible, and if Hitler had won World War II, it might have been in some ways. There was a fair amount of forced labor during that war. But nonetheless, I mean, just the idea is just unthinkable, literally. And it did not happen because it was economically bad. Slavery was booming. The Atlantic slave trade in the 19th century is booming. No slave owners gave up slaves for economic reasons. Like the Quakers, they gave them up for moral reasons, but not for economic ones. So essentially they're going against a viable economic institution, which was very costly to get rid of. It was catastrophically costly, of course, in the United States, the Civil War. Nevertheless, they won. Okay, that's an idea. Slavery is simply an idea. You can have slavery. People had it for millennia. You can not have slavery, and you can still, live quite nicely. And the same with dueling. Okay. Now I want to go back to the days of yesteryear, which is before 1914, which is where the quote I gave you from Kant came from. This is a statement by Michael Howard, the prominent military historian. Before 1919, war was almost universally considered to be an acceptable, perhaps inevitable, and for many people, a desirable way of settling international differences. And let me give you very quickly a bunch of quotes from that time. I was amazed when I looked at the literature before 1914 in Europe in particular, also the United States, how common these statements were. This is by Émile Zola, the French novelist. War is life itself. We must eat and be eaten so that the world might live, etc. This is by Carl Pearson, a statistician. If you take statistics and have the Pearson product correlation coefficient, he's the guy who invented it. The path of progress is strewn with the recognition that found not the narrow path to perfection, and that dead people are, the stepping stones for progress. An American admiral, war is one of the great agencies by which human progress is effected. Igor Stravinsky, the composer, war is necessary for human progress. Adam Smith, the economist, the art of war is certainly the noblest of the arts. A German historian, he who knows history knows that to banish war from the world would be to mutilate human nature. War is both justifiable and moral. What's not moral is perpetual peace. It's not only impossible, but immoral. These are all serious people. These are very prominent people. My favorite is John Ruskin, who was an art critic in England in the 19th century. A.A. Milne said that probably the closest he ever got to a war was reading The Charge of the Light Brigade in a boudoir someplace. But anyway, he said, war is the foundation of all the high virtues and faculties of men. Peace is historically associated not with loving, plenty, and civilization, but rather with sensuality, selfishness, corruption, and death. Okay, Perpetual peace is a dream, not even a beautiful one. Without war, the world would wallow in materials. Alexis de Tocqueville, so the French social scientist, war always enlarges the mind of people and raises their character. A theologian from Britain, war evokes the best qualities in human nature. A German philosopher, Hegel, wars are terrible but necessary for they save the state from petrification and stagnation. Another philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, it's mere illusion and pretty sentiment to expect much of anything from mankind if it forgets how to make war. A British historian, going about 1914, 1912, just waxing eloquent. Universal peace would be a world sunk in bovine content. These cows would wander around in a nightmare which would be realized, and it'll never happen because until the ice has crept to the heart of the sun, etc. War ennobles all that is mean, a German poet. Okay, now what happened was that as with slavery, before World War I, there were a bunch of people started jumping up and down and saying, let's not do war anymore. There are two prominent books that came out. One was by a woman named Bertha von Suttner, Lay Down Your Arms, which became a spectacular bestseller in 1889, and that really started the anti-war movement, the peace movement, before World War I. And it's somewhat strange. I mean, you say, why then? 1889, Britain had lived, I mean, Europe had lived with the bulk of a century without any major war, really big wars, and the wars that had taken place were fairly small, with maybe one exception, the Franco-Prussian War. These lasted a short period of time, not very many people were killed. It wasn't like she was coming out of it some horror story. It was basically part of the fabric of European civilization. They were basically, from that time, 1889 on, basically for the first time in human history, there was an active anti-war movement. I mean, there's been pacifists, Quakers, early Christians, and so forth, going way back. But this is the first time in history there was a really a group of agitators who were trying to agitate to get rid of war, very much like a century earlier, people had agitated to get rid of slavery. They were doing things like the Nobel Peace Prize, which you heard about. Bertha von Suttner was his Nobel secretary. She got him to establish the Peace Prize. She later won it herself. They had peace society, and had things about how you can replace war with negotiation and things like that. Their motivations, the groups, or it was a polyglot set of groups that are dealing with it, they all agreed that war should be gotten rid of, but they did it from different reasons. Many of these people initially were moralists, basically Quaker types. They just thought killing is evil. So it's moral or religious. They were probably not the most important. Suttner herself, though she would agree it's immoral, what she found was that the most impressive argument against war was essentially aesthetic. It's disgusting. And she would go and explain, she did this novel, a really terrible novel, but it's a great piece of propaganda, in which for about 60 or 70 pages is sort of, like soap opera. And then she goes visits her husband, the main character in this, who's an army officer after a battle. And she just describes what's there. People bleeding to death. People slowly dying from shock. People with one arm basically barely on their hanging out. Dead horses everywhere. The only creatures that were happy were dogs because they had all this dead horse meat to eat. So just sort of, this is disgusting. It's not noble. It's not glorious. It's ridiculous. And that really caught on. Why then? I don't know. But it really started to catch on. Now, in addition, there was a guy named Norman Angell who published a book in 1908, 1909. He published it virtually every year for about 5 years with different editions. And his argument was economic, and there were a lot of other people saying the same thing. And he was drawing on their wisdom and their development. The basic idea was that war may have been made some sense previously, but now we do trade. The way you get rich is through trade, not through conquest. And basically war is stupid. It's irrational economically. You're better off to live at peace and trade rather than conquer and so forth, and all the difficulties of conquest. And then finally there's a fourth group who is basically ideological. Some of the early feminists of that time were in that group. Most importantly, probably were the socialists. Socialists in Europe, basically seeing war as a way in which the capitalist class kills off the working class. They become a cannon fodder. So what happened before World War I was these ideas were there. And they were gaining in some degree of credibility. However, they were overwhelmed by the war enthusiasts, the people I already quoted from you, from all places, the wars, the cleansing fires, the thunderstorm, and so forth. And they were ridiculed as the German Youth League. Basically, let us laugh out loud so we can, at the old women in men's trousers who are afraid of war and therefore complain that it's ghastly or ugly. So basically, they were being put down, and they were distinctly a minority group. This is a very famous poem by Rupert Brooke, published just after the very beginning of World War I. And it starts out, now God be thanked, who has matched us with his hour, caught our youth and wakened us from sleeping. With hand-made sure, clear eye, and sharpened power, to turn as going into war is like swimmers in leaping into cleanness. That was the image he used. It's a very famous poem. Okay, what happened was, with World War I, was that these ideas stopped happening. I made a big effort, and other people have as well, to find statements like this after World War I, and you can find them very occasionally here and there, but basically you can't find these people saying this anymore. And so these are by four or five historians and political scientists saying that there's this major transformation in this attitude. And I want to think that that was really important. No longer was all those statements I gave you before, which sound like they're out of the, out of the, almost impossibly bizarre, were no longer being spouted. War was now something that you really took seriously. You may not want to give it up in those cases, but you wanted to not have it again. And you want to get it at least under some degree of control. So what happened after World War I was that the peace movement, my argument is that you had this horrible slaughter of World War I, which wasn't worse than a lot of other previous wars, like the Napoleonic War, there have been horrible wars before, but it was the only war before which there was an anti-war movement. And so these ideas were there, even if they were dismissed by a lot of people. And so when you get into the 1918, 1920, and so forth, it's like the peace movement is running things. They want to do a League of Nations. They want to pass things outlawing war. They want to have efforts for international mediation and so forth. They wanted the Red Cross, to reduce the horrors of war in terms of human suffering, and so forth. And the various peace treaties, the peace society ideas basically grew. And so, in my view, essentially, that was pretty much the last of the big wars, except obviously for World War II. And since that time, developed countries have engaged basically in four kinds of wars. One was World War II, and I don't have time to deal with it now, but I'd be glad to if you want to, and of course it's in the books. World War II in Europe, it seems to me, was entirely made possible by Adolf Hitler. If Hitler had been run over by a truck, or if he instead the guy next to him had been killed at the putsch in Munich in the 1920s, World War II would never have happened. There's also an argument, by the way, very prominent among Holocaust scholars, which is no Hitler, no Holocaust. And that's, I think, pretty widely accepted. There's also a large number of historians that have said what I just said about World War II. Hitler was the only one who wanted war. One of the reasons Hitler was successful was that no one could possibly believe that anyone would want to repeat World War I again. And in every single foreign policy speech that Hitler made in the 1930s when he was Chancellor of Germany, he explained how he hated war, how he was opposed to it, how his racial theory was against it. Because we conquer somebody and we get a bunch of Poles. No, read my stuff, I hate it. Why would I want to take over a bunch of Poles? So I can't be expansionary. And every single speech, it was the biggest lie, of course, but nonetheless, it was taken seriously because it was plausible. I fought in World War I was gassed, I was blinded by gas. Everybody in the Nazi party said, we don't want to do that again. So he said that repeatedly. Okay, in World War II, of course, ended in 1945. The other forms that has happened are colonial war, because a lot of these countries had colonies, and they eventually got out of them, but sometimes there were wars in the colonies. Cold War during the period from 1945 to 1989, and then also what I'll call policing wars, which I'll talk about in more detail later. But before getting to that, let me talk about this. Since 1945, now we're dealing with this 2/3 of a century ago, we're dealing with a situation in which there's been no wars, essentially, international wars among developed states. And it strikes me as being that's enormously significant. 0 is clearly the most important number in the history of warfare, which is the number of big wars, or even small wars among the Gulf states that have taken place since 1945. Now, there's a couple of sort of minor, fundamentally trivial possible exceptions to that. And also what has happened is that war of that sort, World War II or World War III, has now become, I think, subrationally unthinkable. In Europe, there are a whole bunch of really clever people in France, and there have been a whole bunch of really clever people in Germany. And for centuries, the really clever people in each country have figured out how to get into wars with each other, and done a brilliant job of getting into wars with each other. Since 1945, I think it's impossible to find anybody who ever advocated that. In fact, if you got up on the soapbox in Germany and said, let's attack France, people wouldn't even know how to respond. They wouldn't even know the costs will outweigh the benefits. They would not dismiss it because it's a bad idea, but because it's an absurd idea. We don't need to do that. We don't do that. We don't do that anymore. They wouldn't have a reason for explaining why we don't do that overall. So that's I think extremely important. Okay. Now let me talk about wars that have taken place since 1945. I want to be careful to define what I mean by war. And there's various ways of defining it, and my statistical and trend observation would hold pretty much with any kind of definition of war. But I've taken what I think is pretty standard political science definition of a war. A war is something, a violent armed conflict, in which at least 1,000, I don't know how you get rid of that thing, that's supposed to say 1,000 military and civilian battle-related deaths are suffered in the year indicated. So that's a very small war, 1,000 dead. World War I, did that before lunch on some days. World War II, the American Civil War, Korea War, Vietnam, with 1,000 a year was extremely small. That's on both sides. Wars are also conflicts between countries, if they're international wars, or between a government and a reasonably organized civil resistance on the other, and that's a civil war in that case, but it has to be a government. So I'm excluding things like genocide, one-sided violence. In other words, you have to have a war is two sides, or at least two sides, going against each other. It's not a bunch of thugs going to a village and killing everybody. That's one-sided violence. It's not a war. It's a horrible thing, but I just don't want to call it a war, and most people, I think, would agree with that. And so we're dealing with war in that sense. And again, if you define it other ways, you get pretty much the same thing. Okay, since World War II, this is the number of international wars that have been held per year. Very small number, 1, 2, and 3. In many of these cases, they're very minor affairs. Some of them are really bad, like Vietnam or Korea. Most of them are pretty small. Since the end of the Cold War, which is here, there's only been really one really old-fashioned type war, one war in all that period of time, in which one country goes after another country because of disagreement over territory, or something like that. That was a war between Eritrea and Ethiopia that took place at the very end of the last century, last 3 years. Really bad war. But nonetheless, that's the only case. There's none others. There are other interventions, policing wars, which we're going to talk about next. And the only international war that's taken place by this definition in this century is the one in Iraq. The war in Afghanistan is considered by these people who do these lists as essentially an internationalized civil war. The United States came in on the side of one of the combatants in the Civil War, so you can count that as an international war if you want. But this is the only one really, at least by these definitions. Okay, the second kind of war is the imperial and colonial wars, which can be stacked on top of these. And these are the numbers here. As you can see, there are a fairly large number of those going through, but obviously as colonialism died out and imperialism died out, so did the wars that were part of them, and then these countries became independent countries around the world, in Asia and Africa in particular, as well as in the Pacific and places like that. Then the third category, civil wars, and the numbers of those look like this. Extreme increase from the 60s up to about 1990, 1989, which is when I was published Retreat from Doomsday, and then a precipitous decline afterwards. So I'm going to deal with civil wars, but let me first deal with policing wars. There's basically two kinds of wars left. One is policing wars, which I'll now talk about, and the other is civil wars. Policing wars came, they came even during the Cold War, but after the Cold War, what seems to have happened effectively is a lot of people sat around saying, look, we in the developed world have a lot of military force, and we no longer disagree with each other, basically. The Cold War is over, and that was a big division. And everybody basically agrees if a civil war breaks out in Bosnia, for example, that's a really bad thing. And it's not that one group, like the Soviets, would support one side and the Americans would support the other. We want to get rid of that war. We don't know how to do it, but we're against it. So therefore, we should use our joint forces somehow to police civil wars and also police really bad regimes that are killing their own people. So that idea came out, and on the right side, the black things are places where there were various forms of interventions, military interventions. Most of those don't actually come to become wars. In other words, there weren't 1,000 people being killed, but some of them do. So that's policing wars. So a possibility is that these will actually continue, but as you can see very vividly, I think, with the discussion over the war in Libya, in Syria, which is, it's got to be a way of getting rid of it. It says Syria down there, in the right-hand corner. Is that there's just a lot of reason not to go in. One is the aversion to nation building. After you've gotten it, then you have to rebuild it, and that's really a messy process. That was known going way back, certainly to Somalia, but it obviously is known very much in the two 9/11 wars, Afghanistan and Iraq. Second is very low tolerance for casualties in humanitarian ventures. Let me give you this. This is, is there nothing the U.S. could accomplish in Somalia is worth the death of even one more American soldier? 60% agree. Well, politically, that's a big, very low tolerance, to say the least. And the third is basically lack of political success. The biggest success on this list is the Gulf War of 1991. George H.W. Bush pulled off. It was a spectacular success by the standards. It came up very well. Very few casualties. American casualties were astoundingly low, far lower than expected. Kuwait was liberated. Saddam Hussein, the big demon of all time, was pushed back to Iraq and so forth. George Bush was on cloud nine, as he pretty much should have been, and he lost the election next year. In 1992, he kept going around trying to remind people of his wonderful war, and even veterans groups said, "Oh, George, we know about the war. Tell us about the economy." And basically, so he had a big bump, that's for sure. But by the time he ran for re-election, he was out. Now let me turn now to, so it basically seems to me the future of these wars is very limited in terms because of those reasons overall. I think we're now into the sort of Afghan or Somali syndrome period in which people say, let's not do that again. They said that after Vietnam, there weren't Vietnams. They said that after Somalia, there weren't Somalias. So after Somalias, and the two wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, of course, remain possible because politically possible because of the 9/11. So direct attack on the United States. If there's another direct attack on the United States or another Pearl Harbor or something, then you can imagine obviously Americans going back to war in that case, but not for humanitarian ventures, including disasters that are going on, such as the very highly publicized one in Syria. Okay, these are the civil wars, and as you can see, this is just the civil wars now, and it's the same thing I showed you before, but the other stuff is left out. Let me turn to what a lot of these civil wars are like. I'll bring back my guide with the Slivovitz. That's not gin, that's not wine, and that's not beer, that's brandy, plum brandy. What you find, let me just give you a couple of examples. What you tend to have in a lot of civil wars, not all of them, is criminal predation by small groups. Sometimes, as in Bosnia, the small militia groups. Sometimes, as in Bosnia and in Croatia, these were basically criminal groups that were put into the war by leaders because they couldn't get anybody else to fight. This is one of them, Arkan's Tigers, who was basically a underworld thug with a small group of people they call themselves the Tigers, in Belgrade. and they were enlisted to go into the war. What happened was the wars in Bosnia began, and there were total desertions. The Serbs wouldn't show up. So they had to get somebody to fight it, and they turned to criminals. They basically became mercenaries. Arkan's group is very small, maybe a couple hundred at the top, but these guys are vicious thugs, and against civilians, like any good criminal, criminals are really great at persecuting unarmed civilians. Fighting other people, not so good. And this is Warren Zimmerman, who was the ambassador, talking about the paramilitaries who were so much a part of that war. They were embezzlers, thugs, professional killers, rose from the slime, become freedom fighters and national heroes. This is a British journalist talking about what they look like. They're boozy at best, wild and sadistic at their worst, toothless goons with inflammable breath. And that seems to be fairly said. It wasn't that everybody was like that, but that was the general intent. So in Bosnia, what you had is the government basically hiring thugs to fight their wars. Then in Africa, oh, this is another case, by the way. East, also from some journalists, East dresses that he had been cast as a thug by a movie director. The atrocities in the Bosnia are committed by young urban gangsters in expensive sunglasses, dangerous primitives. A theater director called for a war crimes trial against Sylvester Stallone because he was responsible for a lot that has gone on there. Presumably he was kidding. But there were a lot of wars dealing with, Rambo was very important. In fact, many of these guys were called Rambos, and they would have the little bandana and everything. And there's one group that was fighting for the Muslims that called itself the Black Swans, and it had an emblem which was basically a black swan that was having sex with a supine woman, a person, a human woman. That was sort of the level of their humor, I guess you could say. Let me turn to Africa a little bit, and then also to the Sylvester Stallone thing, where Rambo is also important. There was a horrible war in Sierra Leone, and this is stated by one person looking there. By fighting, you get a lot of money and excitement and see the country. You're going from being nothing in a village to being Rambo. And in both places, alcohol and drugs were very important. In the case of in Yugoslavia, it's mostly that guy with the Slovics. You'd come up to these guys and they'd have a gun, and they'd be so roaring drunk they could barely stand up. That's really scary because they could kill you, and they would not only would they care, but they wouldn't even remember. I mean, that's really scary stuff. He's got a gun and he's standing there. This is a book by a guy named Ishmael Bey, which has some controversy around it. But he talks about, he was a boy soldier in Sierra Leone, and he talks repeatedly about how they're constantly on drugs. And it took months to come off once the war ended. He later attended overdose. Another war is in Liberia, and this is some of the people who were fighting the wars from these little militia groups. This is the other version. The first way you get criminals into a war is the government hires them, which is what happened as mercenaries, essentially, which is what happened in Yugoslavia. The other one is where you have a really weak government, and then every bandit gang can essentially be big enough to overthrow the government, potentially. Anyway, this is what some of these guys call themselves: Colonel Action, Colonel Mission Impossible, Colonel Murder, Colonel General Jesus, Major Trouble, General Butt Naked, and of course, General Rambo. General Butt Naked is still around, and he has now converted to Christianity and become a preacher. And he explains in his memoirs, which are published in Nigeria, about how he used to fight totally naked because he thought, except for shoes, and his weapons, totally wiped out on drugs. With his boy soldiers who were similarly attired. His idea was that if you're naked, bullets won't be able to penetrate you. Now, what that suggests, interestingly, is that if you have a real disciplined military force there, you can punch holes in that theory very quickly. The point is, these guys, which were very often very small, there was a town of 50,000 in Bosnia. It was controlled by 15 thugs. 15, totally controlled, and drove out the Muslims in that case. And that's the case here. You have these very small groups of people who are able to cause total havoc. This is a child soldier. Again, you might see him on a small bicycle. There's a DVD, a documentary called Liberia and Uncivil War, dealing with the situation there in 2003 rather, which if you look at it really gives a good feel for what fighting was like. You have basically drunks, drugged soldiers with guns and mortars. They are throwing these things around more or less at each other, though they don't know where each other are. So if you're in the area and in Monrovia or Freetown or wherever, the capitals of these countries, there's basically, there's no place that's safe. You're not likely to be killed because these guys are fantastically inaccurate, but sometimes they actually lob something and kill somebody. So consequently, everything destroys itself. I mean, there's no commerce, there's no civility, nothing happens. It's just everybody is constantly figuring out where's the next motor shop in hometown. And maybe not for 3 days, and then suddenly my child is killed, or somebody shooting someplace. So you get a real feel for that overall. Okay, now there's various theories about the two peaks here, which is a key issue, obviously. One is the big increase up to 1990, and then the other is the very hopeful decrease, spectacular decrease of these wars. It seems to be both of them have the same explanation. It's that it has to do with the quality of government, being able to police. Policing is not difficult because you don't have to have, like Hobbes says, a leviathan of a government. All you have to do is a fairly small disciplined force that will take these guys on, because they're not really very good combatants. They don't even fight each other very much. They're very good at killing unarmed civilians, not to mention raping and pillaging and so forth, but they're not really very significant combatants. They're basically Rambos running around, except at least he knew how to fire a gun overall. Okay, it seems to be what happened in the upswing is basically decolonization, creating a whole lot of very poorly run countries, very weak governments. And the best, there's a bunch of studies indicating that you have civil wars in countries that are not, you tend not to have civil wars in countries that are strong democracies or strong autocracies. So basically what they mean is you got a strong government. And a strong government, by definition, means that you don't have civil wars. If in fact you have a civil war, then certain indications you don't have a strong government. And so you have a lot of weak governments. And I think one of the main reasons for, there's another explanation, which is the Rambo movies themselves, that the peak basically was coming up, as they're going up the Rambo movies basically came out. And then the decline, of course, is there weren't any Rambo movies. However, we now have a test because Rambo 4 came out in 2009. Which is right here precisely, and as you can see, the number of civil wars has not gone up. So that theory probably doesn't hold very well, and I'm much more likely to, as an explanation, use these arguments. As I've already suggested, what has happened is, in these countries, is that decent, if not perfect by any means, governments have been set up repeatedly. I just talked to a guy from Sierra Leone. He was visiting Mershon just a month ago. And they asked him about why violence happened. Why didn't you go back to fighting? You were so good at it. It's so horrible. And those guys must still be there. And he said, yeah, they're there, but they're all running for election now. He had nothing but contempt for the placidity and gentleness of American politics. He said, you want to see real democracy, come to Sierra Leone. We really know how to call each other names. But we're not killing each other either. And also the last two things of exhaustion and attitude change. That people realized who lived through these wars, many of these wars went on and off for decades, because they're not really so much wars as criminal predation. And the criminals were making money, not to mention getting plenty of drugs. And so consequently, they have no incentive to end the war. They have an incentive not to get killed if they can work that out. But they preying on civilians eventually, et cetera. Anyway, so there's been a change of that, and that has also, I think, helped to lead to substantial governance and just an exhaustion effect. In addition, a lot of people point to the United Nations, the theme of this conference is where do we go from here? Essentially what has happened is we've had this astounding drop in civil wars. It's not zero, and there's no reason to think that it's impossible for it to get better. Just people can now start wearing, their caps, baseball caps with Bill in front. But nonetheless, it seems to be staying for a considerable period of time. Kofi Annan and other people talk about peacekeeping, and sometimes peacekeeping means stopping wars, like the one in Syria. Well, that's really hard. And the United Nations and other forces, with some exceptions, have not really been able to do it. It's just for the reason I gave before. Even if it's a fairly much of a walkover war, they're surely going to get some casualties on your side, and you're not willing to tolerate it. Then you got the nation building and so forth afterwards, there's the mess and everything. So peacekeeping in the sense of stopping wars, peacemaking it should really be called, is really difficult. But if you get a position as now, you've got peace, There's no combatants on any side, but there are people who still have guns, and there's the people who could still, start lurching into warlordism or banditry, which could eventually threaten the state. It's a time when you can really help, and it's safe. You're not going to be killed. You're not going into a war zone. You're going into a peace zone, but a miserable one. And the people there in Liberia and Sierra Leone and so forth are anxious to have help. Now, no one talks about this very much. It's not, and so the United Nations and other IGOs, international government organizations, and so forth, have been there, and you've got basically, it's also cheap. I mean, the dollar goes a long way in Liberia. So consequently, you need people who are skilled and understand the area and so forth. I don't mean it's a walkover by any means, because you can make things worse if you don't do it right. But relatively small amount of money going there to help these people help themselves. What you really want to do ultimately is have them develop a really effective government and particularly a police and to a degree military force to keep the wars from starting again. A lot of people argue that that's the reason there hasn't been, its levels remain low for this whole century of civil wars. But it may be that it would not have gone back anyway because of the exhaustion. At any rate, what happens is no one talks about this. In fact, in the mid-90s, the last decade, about 2004, 2005, the United Nations put out a story about under-considered stories. And one of them was the peacekeeping paradox. It said, one thing that hasn't been covered is there's a whole lot of peace to be kept. You have peaceful countries that were in these miserable, horrible civil wars, and they're at peace, meaning no one's killing each other. They got a lot of problems, but killing each other isn't one of them. So therefore, it's a wonderful opportunity to basically really help these countries help themselves. It has to be done carefully. It's not easy. It's not a walkover, but nonetheless, the opportunity is there. They made this story, which we call the peacekeeping paradox, and they hoped it would be picked up by the press. It got picked up by two places I checked. One was the Laird News Hour, which is where I found out about it, and the other was Business Week. No one else thought there was anything very interesting about talking about the fact that there's a lot of peace to keep. And that basically is the way it seems to be going. So that's where, essentially we're in a golden era in some respects. Now the question is, when this will continue, but before getting there, let me talk about things very quickly. Just sort of, if war is over, or in really demise, in other words, if you take off the question mark from the lecture that the fellow just taught, there's a whole lot of theories about war that don't hold up. It's biology and psychology. The human nature seems to be the same. The aggressive drive is the same. Testosterone levels are the same as they've ever been. War is still thrilling. We haven't come up with a moral equivalent to it, etc. Same about resentments. Nationalism, religious extremism are still out there. There's certainly plenty of inequality. No one has said the world is broken into total brotherhood by any means. We still have plenty of lack of love, justice, harmony, goodwill, inner peace. There's plenty of hate, selfishness, and racism. We have to get rid of those to get rid of war. It'd be a good idea on their own, but not necessarily to get rid of war. In the case of weaponry, getting rid of weapons, they're still there. They're by the zillions all over the place. And nuclear weapons among them. Controlling weapons had nothing to do with these trends, basically. Economic development is a great idea, but international trade is a great idea. Economic interdependence are great ideas. Communication, but obviously there's a long way to go for that. It's not obvious that those have been necessary for this change. And then finally, institutions. The state system is the same, the nation system is the same. United Nations has not become something that's gotten rid of, what Roger was talking about, gotten rid of the anarchy in the world. International law has not taken over the world. We've not been able to follow law, renounce war. Democracy has followed this pattern much more slowly. There aren't security communities. So a lot of the arguments about why war would end no longer hold there. Okay, I got sort of three responses when I say this. Some people say, first of all, it's not true. And I think that I pretty well show that is true. They're wrong. Steve Pinker will be here. Just one of the more recent people who's written books, a very good one about the decline of violence generally. He's a very good friend. We've had many long conversations. He tends to see other things than I do as being important, with my emphasis on ideas. His is on other things in part. So I sort of disagree with this whole book, except its whole point. So it's a really good book. He's a really great guy. Anyway, I can argue that it definitely is happening. The next statement, however, is, okay, it's happening, but I still have faith in my fellow man, as my editor put it to me. But okay, we're down there, there's hardly any wars going on, but we'll figure out how to do it. We're really smart people. We don't blow each other up. We'll figure it out. I have no particular answer to that, but I just like to point out two things. One is the astounding peace in Europe. There's a lot of problems in Europe, like the Greeks lying about their debt and so forth. But no one is talking about taking over Greece and making it work right, making a colony. Europe, it's unthinkable, war in Europe. That's been going on for 2/3 of a century, and it may be time to take that seriously. And then the other is the decline of civil war. When I was writing in 2004, the Remnants of War book, it had just hit that bottom, and there was no way of knowing it was going to continue. But now, 8 years later, it's still at that relatively low level. There's still some bad wars out there, but very few of them. So I feel pretty confident. And then the other argument is, okay, you may be right, but what about inequality in South Africa? It's sort of a generic thing. Yeah, there are other problems, and I can perfectly well agree. We got to worry about terrorism, and then there's all kinds of other things you might also want to worry about in various ways. Simply getting rid of war doesn't mean that everything is wonderful by any means. So there's plenty of things, if you're a pessimist, to keep you busy. So let me end on that. Time for questions here. Let's see.
You can see he's a big boy. I think he can probably point to you. And I'm not going to moderate too much here.
Okay, let me ask you a bit about, I guess my question is mostly related to technology. You can make an argument, I think some people have, that a lot of the decline of the attractiveness of war came with the development of technology, especially photography in the middle of the 19th century and early 20th century, where people learned how ugly war was. And the other side of that, though, what we've seen, I think, in the past 2 decades, is that technology has been used to sanitize war, especially in this country, starting with the first Gulf War, and making it attractive. Andrew Bacevich's argument about that and how it ties into U.S. militarism. And so in a way, I agree with almost everything you say, but it seems like, again, the U.S. is exceptional in the sense that perhaps that disillusionment with war has not progressed that far in this country. And the technologies that we have now, along with the smart weapons and the robotics and so on, have in a way almost made it more palatable. Do you understand?
Okay, let me do a whole bunch of questions in there. Questions about technology and so forth. I don't think technology is very important in changing attitudes. The big changes in the 19th century are from books, descriptive, novel, in which Bert von Suter basically just described what it looked like, where there were no pictures, and there still aren't very many pictures out. It's been the war generally that's sanitized. People don't show, dismembered bodies or even corpses, and so that really hasn't changed overall. So I think what has changed is basically the fact. Okay, it's really bad, and we don't want to do that anymore. You don't have to have a picture of it or sort of communication about it. It's basically the idea. It's not the medium, it's not the message. It's the message, and the medium is basically, the technology is the thing in the middle. It brings you the fact. And what happens in support for wars in Iraq, the war did not drop simply because of pictures, because people kept adding it up and saying it doesn't make sense. They didn't have to see pictures overall. I don't think there's a lot of people who argue that the United States has become a peculiarly militaristic society, and I just don't think that's true. You get that from the right by Robert Kagan. Americans are from Mars and Europeans are from Venus. And you also get it from the left, including Rachel Maddow and the semi-left, which would be Andrew Bacevich, arguing that the United States has become very militarized. The thing that they leave out, I think, is 9/11. The United States certainly had a big military for various reasons, though it was very much in decline before 9/11. And what happened was the shock of that, which caused these 2 other wars. The result, I think, is going to be what I talked about before, namely the Iraq syndrome. Let's not do that again. So when the United States was invited to get into the Libyan war, well, we'll lead from behind, we'll lob these things. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to get boots on the ground, that kind of thing. And they're reluctant, and other countries also, for the most part, like European countries. And the same also, I think, with Syria. No one really wants to get mixed up in the middle of that. So I think what has happened is the United States is fairly much like the Europeans, except that 9/11 was something. And as I mentioned, if there's another Pearl Harbor, the United States will be back in it. Or if there's a Pearl Harbor in France or Britain, they'll be back in it. So we're really attacked. But I think basically what's going to be happening now is a real reluctance to get involved in these things overseas. Questions? Okay, next section.
Sorry for coming in. First of all, very interesting talk. The question I would have is, your picture, your painting, is obviously very optimistic.
Only if it gets violence.
Yes.
Let me say that when my book had come out in 1889, it was been pilloried by people saying, Mueller says war is being obsolete. What a horrible thing. So when my book came out, people said it was hopeful, but that's only because people didn't agree necessarily, but that's only because they didn't like violence.
Yeah, the question that I would have is, a lot of your ideas are based on events that are happening in Europe, or let's say broader than the Western world. And thinking ahead, so to speak. There's a lot of other areas of the world where some of the ideas that you brought up here could be doubted. And so I would like to hear about those areas that are not based on Europe, because what you mean here is wars and ideas very Eurocentric. And in that sense, there's a lot of other areas of the world where many of these ideas do not hold up. And I would like to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the question about sort of the trend of these ideas. As I mentioned at the outset, I've done a lot with trying to trace the historic movement of ideas. And over the last 300 years, almost everything is from west to east. Before that, there's lots of things from east to west. I asked the historian, Jeffrey Parker, can you name me any idea that's gone from east to west in the last 300 years? And he said, no. I mean, there has been some like Thai cuisine that's come from the east to the west, things like that. And maybe some of the things the Japanese are doing in terms of first pass, some of the manufacturing techniques. But I think in the last 300 years, there's been a process of westernization in the sense that Gabon has become more like Canada than Canada has become like Gabon. And so that there's been a filtering of these ideas. So when I wrote Retreat from Doomsday, there was still lots of war, international war included, in the developing world. And so I suggested that might have had might follow, but I have no for sure. I think it has happened. The number of international wars is extremely small, generally. A lot of other ideas, women's rights, the capitalism, democracy, and so forth, that basically we've all started in Manchester, England, and sort of spread through the world over a period of 200 years, including definitely democracy. So I don't see that pattern particularly changing, though it might. A lot of people talk about this century being the Asian century, and may well be. There's an awful lot of smart people in the East, and they no longer are killing each other off. A huge number of wars in Southeast Asia, and China was under this unbelievably horrible Mao Zedong regime for a long time. So you might find, and in India, of course, as well, you got a lot of people, there are a lot of smart people, and you might see ideas coming the other direction. There's no reason why it has to go from west to east, but it just simply hasn't. But those ideas have, they follow this trajectory pretty much. And I think that's a standard pattern. And so I keep waiting for the ideas to go the other direction. And the key place would be India and Pakistan. India and particularly Japan. I mean, China wasn't a free society, so ideas don't flower. But Japan is not that way. And it's very productive, and terrific health standards, and very good at making Toyotas and things like that, and a lot of business things. But there really haven't been any ideas coming out of Japan, even a free free Eastern big society, or South Korea would be another case in point. And China, if it basically continues to liberalize or does liberalize. So that's the way it goes. But that's, you know, it is happening. You know, it has happened. The progression of both the aversion to war and also to democracy and also ideas of free markets. Pick up international trade. So, so far that's bold and firm. I see no reason why it has to kick in. You know, it has styles too. You know, rock music. You know.
One more question.
Yeah, as opposed to the aversion to war, this is kind of a cultural question. We're in a city that annually has something called Thunder over Louisville, which includes massive displays of mighty Air Force and other aircraft performing tricks and so on. These have become a form of entertainment. Chicago has a water and sea show, maybe in all sorts of cities. They're family entertainments, they're free, people come. So that's one version of a kind of not just a promotion by the military of their own hardware, but an embrace of it by the public paying the taxes for them. We've also got occasions when military-style clothing becomes very fashionable. And I wonder if you could just comment on both this decrease of war in terms of your whole lecture, but we still have this glorification, honoring, and romanticizing, I would say, as opposed to the horrible reality.
Now, the issue would be, we still have the military, obviously, so do other countries, but the question is, do we want to send them into harm's way? And it seems to be we don't. Both Iraq and Afghanistan would probably not have taken place except for a direct attack on the United States, as it would seem. So it's not, and after Somalia, you know, 25 guys get killed, 19 and a few others here and there, and people say, let's get the hell out of there. With all this military spirit, you know, we could go in and level Somalia. No one seemed to want to do that. So the air shows may continue, the budgets will continue. The budgets were in decline, military budgets were in decline before 9/11. And so in many respects, what has happened since that time is because of the wars and because of terrorism, or the exaggerated fears of terrorism, in my view. So it doesn't seem to me that even people are saying, boy, those, you know, looking over Louisville and seeing those planes flying around, that's really great. Let's have them bomb somebody overseas. You know, they come back the next day, well, they're still flying up there, you know, the next year. So it's circuses, but it's not people saying we should use this to kill people. So it seems to me that they're really very separable. In one case, you could argue that it's a massive waste. Why are we spending all this money on things that only do air shows in Louisville? But it doesn't imply, it seems to be a real military experience overall. So the book I want to do is called American Foreign Policy, Vast Proclamations and Half-Vast Execution. Because we talk about the indispensable nation and all that. You're so indispensable, why don't you do something more about Libya? Well, you know, so they talk about getting bit up too much.
If you think that he's optimistic about war, yesterday in class my students learned that it's more dangerous to be in your bathtub than to be worried about the threat of terrorism. So when he mentioned that threat, I'm going to lead the applause here. Thank you.